Hi, this is Thomas Graves, and welcome to the Black Mold of Grief. This is episode 1, and it's a shorter episode because it's basically just an overview of the podcast in general, what my goals are for myself, for my healing, and possibly for you. I want to start with my credentials, which are none from a clinical standpoint, but I do have some street credentials when it does come to grief. I have lost 2 moms, a best friend of 13 years, a nephew, a sister, and then a dog that I adopted and had with me for 10 years to help me grieve the first 3 losses. So while I don't have any letters after my name, I have been dealing with grief since I was 2 when I lost my mom. And I do have 2 goals for this podcast. First, with folks that are new to grief, I kind of want to be a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't learn how to grieve. And maybe you can learn from my mistakes, which I will share. And then for the folks like me who didn't know how to grieve when they first experienced grief, I want to help give them maybe a roadmap to go back and undo the damage that happens when you don't grieve. And because what I've learned is that grief for me wasn't just the loss of the loved ones. I've had to grieve the damage caused by not knowing how to grieve. And that damage was loss of relationships with family, loss of a job, loss of other relationships, and loss of a chance at happiness, multiple chances at happiness. And I had to grieve all of those things. And so I have named this podcast The Black Mold of Grief because it isn't just the loss. Not learning how to grieve created black mold, and that's what I had to learn how to grieve. And I've also learned that the black mold wasn't just really inside of me, it was inside of my entire family because we were all grieving, we were all in pain, and we were and still are a good family that loves each other. We were just in a lot of pain, and so we didn't know what to do with it, so we kind of slung it at each other from time to time and caused more pain. And that led to my moment of epiphany on how I needed to heal. And that moment was after a family fight. I was driving home and I realized that if I died in that moment and went to heaven and met my mom for the first time, the conversation with her would basically be me just complaining about all of the pain of my life. And I would, in essence, be telling her that her death ruined my life because it set in motion all of these things that just caused a tremendous amount of pain, and that I had never truly been happy. And in that moment, I literally just had this intense panic that that was not the conversation she deserved. That's not the conversation I deserved. And I didn't know how I was going to change that, but I made a promise to her and a promise to myself that I was going to change it. I didn't know how, didn't know how long it was going to take, but I knew I was going to do whatever I could to make that change. And that was the moment I decided to heal, and it's been quite a journey. And having a great conversation in heaven with my mom about my life since I've seen her last has become my goal. And if it's okay with you, that's my goal for you. And that's the purpose of this podcast. Is I think we all deserve to have a great first conversation in heaven with our loved ones. And when we start sharing our lives that we've had since we've seen them last, I think we deserve and they deserve for that conversation to be a joyous conversation. And that isn't easy because when you're in pain, it's tough to feel joy and it's tough to pursue joy. But I think that's what I'm shooting for. And If that's something you're interested in, maybe learning how to do, that's what I want to help you possibly learn. But before we really dig into all of that, I do want to lay down some boundaries and ground rules of that I've set for myself and out of respect for you, and talk through some terms that I use to define and visualize my grief so that we can be on the same page. And the reason I do that is because I describe and visualize grief kind of like a really severe sunburn, in that when you are sunburned and you get dressed, leave the house, other people may not know that you're sunburned, and they can come up and pat you on the back with very honorable, good intentions and inflict tremendous amount of pain on you without knowing it. And that's a possibility with this podcast, and I'm very aware of that. And I have great intentions, but I can still inflict pain without meaning to. And so the purpose of this next little section is to kind of lay down those terms and definitions so that when I say things, you understand what it is I'm actually saying. So the first thing is I had to divide the original grief from the impact and the damage of not grieving. And so I am from Houston, and there's a lot of floods, and we use the term floods of emotion. So what I started doing was visualizing a flood and then the aftermath of the flood. And when it comes to grief, people say, well, everybody grieves a different way, and that is 100% true. But then there's also a universal element to grief, and I couldn't quite figure out where that line was and how to strike that balance. And because I started grieving when I was 2, I actually didn't grieve. When I did finally start to grieve later and I was looking back, I realized that at 2, I didn't know how to grieve. And so I just was grieving inside of other people's comfort zones, is how I started to frame it. And in terms of floods, what that meant was I was sealing everything in. I wasn't letting the pain and the moisture evaporate. So essentially, I was just painting over everything to make it look good on the outside, sealing all of that moisture in and causing black mold. And then once I started to excavate all that later, I overcorrected, and I went from I'm going to grieve like everybody else to I became extremely isolated and almost proud that no one else knows what I feel. This is mine. And I went to the very opposite extreme, which was just as unhealthy. And so again, trying to find that balance between what is sacred to me, what do I need to protect, what is mine, and where do I need to draw that line, but also not become isolated. So the black mold and the flood is how I strike that balance. An example of that balance would be my nephew Matthew and my sister Teresa. So with Matthew, he is Matthew. Okay, to me, he is my nephew. To my sister and brother-in-law, he is their son. To my niece, he is her brother. To his wife, he is her husband. So even though he is the same person, to each of us, he is a different flood when those floods of emotions come in. And they are sacred, and I would never go to any of them and say that I know their pain, even though I have the pain of losing Matthew. And so I am very respectful of that. Same thing with my sister. I would never say anything to my brother-in-law that I know his pain, because that is his wife. You would never say anything to my nephews because that is their mom. So I give that respect, and I also demand that respect, because those floods are sacred to each of us. And so in this podcast, I will not attempt to discuss those floods, because they are sacred. The other aspect of that is not just the loved one that you lost, but how you lost them. Two of my losses came from childhood disease that caught up with them later in life. Two of my losses came from cancer, and one of my losses came from an automobile accident. I haven't lost anyone to the opioid epidemic, haven't lost anyone to suicide. I haven't lost anyone to gun violence. So again, I'm not going to get into those flood aspects because I don't know the pain. That is unique. That is sacred. But after the flood recedes, that is when it becomes a little more universal. And that is where I have learned not to become isolated. When there's the cleanup after the flood, that is when I have learned I need to reach out. I need to ask for help. I need to ask for advice. I need to get input. And again, people say, well, everybody grieves their own way. Yes, but there's still some universal aspects. And I compare it to a house. Everybody's house is different, but the functionality of the house is the same. Everybody has a bed. Everybody has a refrigerator. Everybody has a front door that locks. Everybody has a kitchen sink. And you have 1,000 or more choices for each of those elements of your house, and you get to build your house however you want to build it, and it is unique to you. So that's the same thing with grief. You do get to build your own grief and how you grieve, but the universal aspects of how it functions is the same. And that's where I went off track and I overcorrected to where I felt like I was reinventing the wheel and creating a whole new way of having a house. And that is where I got off track. So balancing those two things, the flood, the black mold, the cleanup, that has helped me know when to hold on to what is unique and mine and protect that and be very defensive against anyone who wants to trespass into my flood, but then also be open to help and committed to asking for help at the right time. The next thing I want to clarify is the term healing. So when I say I have healed or I am healing, because grief never ends. So when I have told people in my personal life that I've healed, they kind of look at me and say, well, it never ends. So let me clarify that. When I say I've healed, I am not talking about the floods in the sense that I haven't stopped the floods from happening. They continue to happen. They happened last week, as a matter of fact, and I'll get into that later in a podcast. So I know the floods will continue to happen. So when I say I have healed, I am not talking about the floods. I have no control over those, and I have surrendered to that reality. When I say I have healed, I am talking about I have gone back and cleaned out all the black mold from when I was 2, and I sealed it in, and it just grew and took on a life of its own. So then that's what I say. That's what I mean when I say I have healed. The other part to that is I am actively healing from my current and future floods, in that I have learned the hard way to stay open and allow my pain to evaporate after the flood. And that leads me to the other point that I want to share, which are the two questions that I ask myself. And they are, what do I do after the flood? And what am I doing in between the floods? Because the third mistake I made is, once I realized how much damage there was and how much cleanup there was, I adopted a sense of futility of, what's the point of cleaning up after the flood if it's just going to flood again? And so I entered a long period of depression where it was just kind of futile. What's the point? And that again triggered my moment of healing, where I realized I wasn't going to bring joy to my first conversation in heaven. And so now, again, no control over the floods, but I can control how I clean up after the floods, and I can control whether or not I pursue joy in between the floods. And that is a tough choice to make, but that is the choice I've chosen to make, because my goal is to have a great first conversation in heaven. And so that's what I want to focus on in this podcast, is cleaning up the black mold, and however brief a time I have in between floods, making the commitment to pursue joy in between those floods. Thank you for tuning into the Black Mold of Grief. In the next episode, we're going to start diving into some of my losses and how I healed. But in the meantime, I want to share my favorite quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. I hope something I've said here today helps you bring a little more joy to your first conversation in heaven, and I hope to see you next time.